So the last time we left off, we had been discussing several candidate models to explain the existence of homosexuality in human populations. And when we were discussing this, I had really taken great pains to ensure that we were reviewing the theories without trying to cast moral judgments on them or those who propose them, and simply treat them as scientific inquiries. And the reason I did this is because, as we noted, topic of homosexuality can be surrounded by a lot of moral sentiments from many different groups of people who have very strong feelings about its acceptability, and they usually also have similarly strong sentiments about the opinions of others on the topic. And these moral sentiments that people have will often govern their own behavior. So, for instance, those who view homosexuality as morally unacceptable might be less willing or sometimes completely unwilling to engage in it, even if they find themselves to have those attractions and find members of their same sex to be attractive. Likewise, people who view stealing as morally wrong might be less likely to steal. These moral perceptions will, to some extent, affect our own behavior. However, the behavioral implications of our moral perceptions extend well beyond ourselves. Humans often want to punish others for doing something that they perceive as wrong. And the desire to see others punished can be so extreme that in some cases, people also want to punish others just for holding what they perceive to be the wrong belief or stance on a particular topic. Just what they think, even if their behavior is otherwise completely morally acceptable. And in the world of sexual behavior, things like homosexuality, sometimes these moral perceptions have gone so far as to result in laws prohibiting people from engaging in it at various times and places, and the punishment for engaging in this behavior has reached the heights of being put to death. Indeed, there are places in the world today where the punishment for homosexual behavior is death. So in other words here, not only do our moral perceptions guide our own behavior, what we want to do, but they also encourage us to guide the behaviors and the thoughts of other people. And this provides us with a very interesting jumping off point for moving forward and examining morality itself. Once we understand more about what morality is, what psychological components morality is made up of, and what biological function it serves, we can better appreciate how morality about specific topics can be shaped and understood. So in understanding the significance of an evolutionary psychological framework here, it's important to make the things that seem familiar and indeed very automatic to us appear strange. Make our automatic perceptions and thoughts seem strange. Because as we saw when we were discussing vision, the ease of execution of our visual systems, that is, you just open your eyes and you perceive the world, it feels very effortless to do. This really hides an immensely complex series of specialized cognitive mechanisms that are capable of translating the inputs of certain wavelengths of light into perceptual outputs of three-dimensional models of the world, complete with things like movement, colors, shapes, objects, distances, things like that. Additional psychological systems will then use the outputs of those visual systems as their own inputs for guiding their behavior, such as moving the muscles in your body to avoid walking into certain objects, approaching some things, avoiding others. Our visual system is immensely complex, both in its inputs and its outputs. However, this visual model of the world is created by the brain. That is, it's not an accurate reflection of what the objective nature of the world happens to be. When you look into the sky and you perceive the sky as blue, that blueness is not a feature of the sky as much as it's a feature of your nervous system, how your brain is responding to certain wavelengths of light. And indeed, as we also reviewed in earlier lectures, there are a great many of these wavelengths of light which our visual system is functionally blind to. We literally cannot perceive them. Things like X-rays, we can't see those, but they exist. There are many wavelengths of sound, similarly, we can't hear. Many chemicals in the environment we can't smell. Without specialized mechanisms for detecting those inputs and then generating the perceptions associated with them, We are simply unaware of their existence. Morality is much the same thing like vision and hearing in this regard. That is, morality is a perceptual dimension on a spectrum of right and wrong. And these are perceptions generated by our minds rather than objective facts about the world. However, morality is also strange in that it's really a rather invisible dimension in the world outside of our heads. That is, you can't observe or physically detect the rightness or the wrongness of an action in the same way you can observe wavelengths of light or sound. In fact, over time, the perceived rightness and wrongness of some things can actually change, quite unlike our perception of color. Some things that are morally acceptable today may be morally unacceptable tomorrow, and vice versa. Whereas people generally seem to agree things that are red yesterday are going to be red tomorrow. So morality is a perceptual dimension of feelings and judgments that we're generating internally. And this alone makes it a rather peculiar type of perception, because we're perceiving something about the world, but it's not quite clear at first glance what we are actually perceiving. So in trying to make sense of morality, we should want to know what these moral mechanisms are attempting to perceive about the world, even though it's not directly observable in an objective sense, and it may shift over time. Also worth noting, these moral perceptions appear rather specific to the domain of behavior, and in many cases, specific to the domain of human behavior. That is, few people would judge a rock to have acted immorally if the rock rolls down a hill and it hits a person and kills them, whereas we would morally judge someone perhaps for pushing or throwing a rock down a hill that ended up killing somebody. So in our earlier lectures, when we were discussing how these male elephant seals show up to the beach and will physically fight off rivals because of the benefits that they can gain from monopolizing these particular territories, few people, if any, raise a moral objection to the behavior of that animal. Whereas you probably would raise a moral objection if you heard stories about how a man at a bar is physically trying to fight other men to get out of the bar. And so this is what I mean when I say our moral psychology appears to typically attend rather specifically to human behavior. However, it doesn't pay attention to all human behavior. That is, not all human behavior is going to trigger a moral perception. If I told you a story about a man who just goes to sleep at night because he's tired, you probably don't have any moral feelings about that one way or the other. So much like our visual system is only processing very specific types of information with very specialized mechanisms, and is blind to other types of inputs, it can't see all wavelengths of light, it appears our moral systems are functionally specified in a very similar way. And they only feel like they respond to certain types of information. And as such, we should want to know why our moral systems respond to what they do and don't respond to what they don't. So morality is also very mysterious in what it encourages us to do. That is, once a moral perception has been generated in our brain, a suite of other psychological and behavioral mechanisms may then be engaged because of that perceptual output. As we just noted, indeed, the output of these moral systems, these perceptions of what's right and wrong, these guide our behaviors, both in terms of what courses of action we choose to take and what courses of action we attempt to make others take or avoid taking. So to help frame why all this morally inspired behavior is very strange, I want you to imagine that we're not talking about human behavior, but instead we're talking about observing the behavior of other non-human species, let's say in this case bears. And the reason I want to do this is because I find that applying theories of psychology to non-human species really helps highlight whether they make any sense or not, as well as bring to light other details that we normally take for granted. It brings those into the spotlight. It's harder to get caught up in this perception of normality. And what we usually do if we start talking about other species. So in our first hypothetical example here, let's say you are a researcher out in the field, and one day you observe a mother bear and her cub. They're walking through the woods and they encounter a strange, unattended cub. So what you see is that the mother with her cub growls at this unrelated strange cub, and in turn, the mother punishes her own cub to get it to behave. She swats at it because attacking this strange cub was wrong. Now you should hopefully be seeing why this suddenly starts sounding a lot more peculiar. Because this scenario seems to cut against predictions from our kin selection theory we reviewed earlier. A mother is inflicting costs on her own related offspring to provide benefits or prevent costs to a stranger. Yet situations like this play out all the time in humans, such as a mother that might punish her own child for hurting a strange, unrelated child at school, or a parent that might punish their child for stealing from a store, even if that child was successful in their theft and they weren't discovered by anyone else. Perhaps parents don't always punish their children for doing this, but that parents ever punish their children for doing this is really a biological mystery of the first degree. We can also think about our elephant seals again for another example. Several examples, actually. First, imagine a hypothetical case where there's a large male elephant seal and it's arrived to this very desirable mating territory, which is currently occupied by a different but much smaller male. Now, this larger male could easily defeat the smaller one in a fight and take the territory for himself, and this would dramatically increase his access to receptive female mates. And we've reviewed in the previous lectures why this is very likely the adaptive course of action for the larger male to take. However, let's say the larger male decides to not engage in this fight because it wouldn't be the right thing to do. After all, hurting the smaller male would be wrong, and taking something that didn't belong to him would be wrong because, hey, the smaller male was there first. So it wouldn't be right for me to step in and beat him up and take the territory and mate with all the females there. So the larger male just leaves. Again, despite this scenario seeming really strange when you apply it to a non-human species, things like this play out in humans regularly, where people refrain from engaging in acts because they are perceived to be morally wrong, even if engaging in those acts would prove immediately personally beneficial. That is, while it might be very easy for me to acquire money or property by robbing my neighbor's house or fighting the family inside until they leave, that's not typically how humans do things. And let's play out one more hypothetical example here. We'll stick to our elephant seals. So the larger male does show up to the beach where the smaller male is. The larger male does attack the smaller male and attempts to take their territory. But what happens then is that a third, unrelated bystander elephant seal that's not involved in the conflict at all, or related to either of the males, observes this fight taking place and then intervenes on behalf of the smaller male to fight off the larger male and protect him, protect the small one. All right, so this intervention seems like really strange behavior, but it happens in humans all the time. People take an intense interest in the behavior of others, and when that behavior is deemed morally unacceptable, third parties may join in these disputes that they otherwise involved in to see that strangers are punished. This punishment can take the form of social exclusion, verbal mockery, legal recourse, or even physical attacks. And it's nominally the job of police to do this very thing, as even non-police will occasionally intervene in conflicts to stop crimes and apprehend criminals, even at a risk to their own safety. Which is not to say people always do this thing, but that they ever do this thing is curious, and it requires explanation. So as we can hopefully appreciate at this point, our moral systems represent something of an evolutionary mystery. These moral systems are attempting to perceive something about the world which can't be directly observed. And we're not entirely sure what that something it's trying to perceive is. Then, once it does perceive whatever it's trying to perceive, it uses those perceptions to both limit our own behavior and to affect the behavior of others. And limiting your behavior in this way tends to be costly. Because if you put restrictions on your behavior that says, don't do anything immoral, well, that's just what you're doing. You are adding restrictions. You are reducing the number of possible actions you might take, and that cuts down on the possible adaptive benefits you might reap. Further, these perceptions aren't just limiting our own behavior. They're encouraging us to limit the behavior of others, even if we're not personally related to them, and even if they're not interacting with us directly. And make no mistake, intervening in other people's behaviors often carries cost. If you imagine trying to stop an armed robber because armed robbery is wrong, the prospect of what those costs are should immediately come into focus. So these mysteries, as well as several others, were the focus of a very excellent paper by two researchers, Discoli and Kurzban. Their paper was entitled Mysteries of Morality, published in 2009, and they outlined a great many important details and ideas about morality. So I want to start by reviewing their ideas, what their solution to this was, what their functional hypothesis for morality is, and then we can get to some concerns about what their solution is, and I can add my personal theory into the mix. So Discoli and Kurzban begin by noting what our psychological moral systems don't seem to be. And that's welfare maximizing mechanisms. Many people make this mistake of conflating altruism, which is being kind to others and delivering benefits to others, with morality. But there are some issues with this conflation. First, as we reviewed in our lectures on altruism, many altruistic mechanisms do not appear to be moral ones. Mammary glands are a great example. Mammary glands are biological altruism devices that deliver caloric benefits to dependent offspring. But breasts aren't moral devices. We have many ways of behaving altruistically without behaving morally. In fact, many moral judgments cut against altruistic or welfare maximizing behaviors. You can behave in ways that make a lot of people better off and be considered highly immoral for doing so. And there are two examples I'm going to review here real fast. The first of these is what we call the trolley problem, and then the second is what we call the footbridge problem. And these are classic examples of thought experiments in moral literature. A lot of work has been done on these, so it's good to know them. You've probably seen a picture like this before. This is the trolley problem. And the trolley problem goes like this. There's an out-of-control train speeding down the tracks towards 5 hikers. And these 5 hikers are unable to get out of the path of the train. And they're all going to die if the train keeps going as it's going. However, you're standing by a lever, and you can pull this lever to divert the train to a side track, where there is 1 hiker. So if you divert the train, the 5 hikers on the main track are going to live, and the 1 hiker on the side track is going to die. And the question that's asked here is whether it's morally acceptable to pull the lever or not. And this has been asked many times of many different people, and what's repeatedly found is that usually about 90% of the people you ask will say, yes, it is morally acceptable to divert the train. And this maximizes the number of people who live. The footbridge dilemma is the sister problem to the trolley problem. Setup is the same. Out-of-control train heading down the tracks towards 5 hikers that can't get out of the way and are all going to die if the train keeps moving forward. However, you're standing on a bridge over the tracks, and you know you can stop the train if you drop a heavy object in front of it. However, the only heavy object available to you happens to be a very large man. So if you push the man off the bridge, he'll fall in front of the train, he'll die, but he's also going to stop the train, and the 5 hikers are going to live. So the question that you ask again here is it morally acceptable to push the man off the bridge? While the welfare considerations in these two examples are exactly the same, 1 person dies, 5 people live, the moral perceptions now swing dramatically, where about 90% of the people will now say it is unacceptable to push the man. So their judgments here are really flipping despite the welfare concerns being exactly the same. So if morality was really just about maximizing welfare gains or delivering the most benefits to other people, we shouldn't really see this difference in moral judgments, because both scenarios deliver exactly the same benefits to exactly the same number of people. However, these acts are judged quite differently, suggesting morality is not really about getting the best outcome per se. And it's not just that these problems are worded strangely, because you can reframe the dilemma into other contexts and it's still viewed as morally wrong. For instance, one way they do that is they say, there are 5 people dying of organ failure in a hospital, and a doctor notices that there's a healthy man in the waiting room. And if the doctor kills the healthy man and harvests his organs, he can save the 5 people. Is it acceptable for the doctor to kill the person in the waiting room? And again, the answer tends to be, for the vast majority of people, no. There's also the research that I want to consider on what's called moral dumbfounding. And what this refers to are cases where you present someone with a story about some action, and then you ask them a question about this. Was the act morally acceptable or was it wrong? If someone states they think the act was wrong, the researcher then tries to interrogate their answers, rather politely when possible, but firmly to see how they defend their position. Why do you think it was wrong? And we're going to examine one such example here from a 2000 paper by researchers Haidt et al. And this paper is called Moral Dumbfounding When Intuition Finds No Reason. So they asked the participants in this experiment a number of different stories, but we're just going to focus on one of them in particular. And this story goes as follows. Julie and Mark, who are brother and sister, are traveling together in France. They're both on summer vacation from college. One night, they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide it would be fun and interesting if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night a secret between them, which makes them feel even closer to each other. So what do you think about this? Was it wrong for them to have sex? Now, initially, when 80% of participants read this story, or heard it rather, they said it was wrong for Julie and Mark, the brother and sister, to have sex. So then the experimenter would ask, why do you think it's wrong? And then they would provide their reasons. The experimenter would attempt to undermine and argue with those reasons. And we would see what the participant then did. So for instance, if someone said it was wrong for Julie and Mark to have sex because babies born from incest are likely to be harmed, the experimenter would then point out, well, Julie was on birth control, Mark used a condom, and no children were born. So then the participants say, okay, fine, no children were born. But it was still wrong because Julie and Mark might suffer psychological harm from what they did. They might feel guilty about their actions. And the experimenter would then point out, well, both Julie and Mark enjoyed the experience and it brought them closer together emotionally. So on average, when they were doing this, participants were trying to explain why they thought this was wrong. On average, they would present and drop 6 different arguments. That is, they said it was wrong for Julie and Mark to have sex because they might have a harmed child. But then they would back off of that reason when no children were born. And then they'd say, well, it's psychological harm. But then they would back off that reason when the experimenter said, well, there was no psychological harm in this example. So they would do this on average 6 times. They would give an example and then say, okay, maybe that's not the reason. And eventually, some participants would just give up and they would say something like, I don't know why it's wrong, but I know that it's wrong. This is what moral dumbfounding is. They know it's wrong, but they can't give a good justification for why. And there are 2 very interesting conclusions from these statements. First, very few participants actually changed their mind. 80% said it was wrong. 17% of them eventually swapped and said, okay, I guess it's all right in this scenario. But most people stuck to their intuition that this was incorrect. So this tells us that generally, it doesn't seem like participants were really debating about this. They weren't coming to some well-reasoned conclusion first and then changing their mind on the basis of available evidence. Instead, it looks more like they generated this intuitive moral judgment, and then after the fact, they tried to defend it. And second, this also tells us that participants were willing to judge an act as wrong even if they had trouble consciously locating any harm that resulted from it. Indeed, another paper by the same researchers found again that about 80% of participants that heard a story about a man who goes to the store, comes home, he's alone, he bought a chicken carcass, and what he does is he has sex with the chicken carcass before he cooks it and eats it. They asked, is that wrong? Again, most people said, yes, that is unacceptable. But the majority of people who heard the story also agreed that no one was being harmed by the act. So much like the trolley and the footbridge dilemma here, these findings point in the direction that morality is not about minimizing harms or maximizing benefits per se. Moral judgments are to some degree what we would call non-consequentialist, that is, not based on consequences. Morality seems to have a different function than simply tracking welfare and ensuring the greatest number of people are better off. So in better understanding the function of morality, Duscoli and Kurzban frame moral dilemmas as a three-person game. And we can see the general structure of the game here. As they conceptualize it, the game has three different roles that you might play. There's the actor, the second party, and the third party. The actor is the person that selects an initial behavior. So, for example, this might be a man who steals from somebody else. The second party is the person that's impacted by this behavior, in this case, the person who was stolen from. And the third party is someone who didn't initiate the action, wasn't directly affected by it, but may choose to intervene to punish the actor nonetheless. And these roles have different best interests, and these actors face different problems. So actors, the people who select the behavior, have more insight into their own motives and intentions. They know what they intend to do, and they know what they did. Their goal tends to involve judging the costs and behaviors of an action. Is it worth it to try and steal from somebody? If they decide to do so, they have to successfully execute their behavior. They have to actually take from someone else. And then they have to avoid detection and punishment by second and third parties. So if I'm a thief, I know what I intend to do, what I attempted to steal or what I actually did steal, and I want to avoid people finding out that I stole, and I want to defend against people who try to punish me for stealing. I would rather third parties stay out of this altogether because I don't want them punishing me, and if third parties do get involved, I'd rather they be on my side and not only not punish me, but defend me. Similarly, if I'm a thief, I would rather the person I stole from not know that I stole from them and be able to defend against them attacking me because of what I did. These second parties, the people who are affected by the behavior, they face the problem of detecting bad actors and defending against the costs they inflict. So the second party may or may not know what happened. They may know they were stolen from, or they might not know. And if they do know they were stolen from, they might not know who stole from them or when someone stole from them. That is, they don't have direct access to the intentions of the actors. So what they try to do is infer them. Did this person intend to steal from me, or did they simply misplace something? These second parties also need to calculate the degree of costs inflicted upon them and weigh the cost-benefit ratio of trying to pursue punitive action against the people who wronged them. And now in some cases, this is going to involve what they call revenge, where I'm going to punish somebody who transgressed against me. Now, importantly here, revenge is not necessarily morality. Returning to our elephant seals, a large male that's on a beach defending his territory may attack another male that enters his territory, a type of form of revenge. I'm going to inflict costs on you for transgressing against me. But this doesn't need to be generated by any perceptions of morality. That is, the large male doesn't need to think it's morally wrong that this other male tried to get on my territory. Where morality tends to enter the equation for second parties is twofold. First, they want to recruit other people to help them. If someone stole from me, I want to recruit more support on my side so I can go and punish the person who stole from me more effectively. And to encourage this involvement, people will also appeal to third-party moral systems. That is, you should help me punish because what the thief did to me was wrong. They try to appeal to those outputs. Additionally, second parties need to be wary of the extent of their revenge. Because revenge that goes too far, what we would consider excessive amounts of punishment, can lose you the support of third parties or even turn them against you in the event you go too far. As an example, if someone steals from me and I say, I want to punish the thief, and what I mean by punish the thief is I want to cut their hands off, you might not get as many people willing to support that type of action. And this is referred to as proportionality. It's a very important component of moral punishment. You might hear this referred to as an eye for an eye, the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. And it's a very important part of this moral puzzle that also requires an explanation. After all, if you want to stop people from transgressing against you, if you want to stop people from engaging in a morally unacceptable behavior, wouldn't it be in your best interests to punish them as excessively as you possibly could? Because the more you punish someone, the less likely they want to transgress against you. That is, if someone steals from you and you don't punish them at all, you give them a literal slap on the wrist, but they keep what they stole from you, well, they'll probably steal from you again. But if someone's going to steal from you and you kill that person, well, now maybe the next person doesn't want to steal from you because they know the costs of stealing are very, very high. And this affects their cost-benefit analysis of should I engage in this behavior. So this is a very important point we're going to return to later. Why is moral condemnation proportional? Anyway, returning to this moral game. Finally, the third role that we see up top is what they call a third party, a bystander. These are people that are not directly involved in the action, but they may choose to become involved in the conflict. So if they become involved in this conflict, they need to weigh, should I become involved or should I not become involved? And if I do become involved, whose side should I take? Should I side with the second party or should I side with the actor? And in doing so, they need to minimize their costs of getting involved in this conflict. So to keep with this theft example, if I stole from someone and I'm unwilling to give what I stole back, in fact, I might even be willing to try and fight someone who comes to reclaim their lost property, you as a third party can get involved in this conflict. I didn't steal from you, I stole from someone else. But you may still become involved in this conflict to assist the victim and try and punish me. And if you do so, I may try to fight you as well. And these disputes can become larger and larger as more third parties join the conflict, turning these into group versus group conflicts instead of individuals versus individuals. So there are costs to becoming involved in the conflict of others, and these third-party costs are very important and need to be explained. So this brings us to one of the very important key takeaways of the Discolian-Kurzban paper, which is once you understand this moral interaction, where third parties might become involved in conflicts on the basis of who did what to who, you really become able to understand this relationship between moral conscience and moral condemnation. Your moral conscience refers to how people are going to guide their own behavior on the basis of moral perceptions. I'm not going to steal from you because I think stealing is wrong. Conscience is that inner voice that tells you what actions you should or should not take because of their moral status. By contrast, moral condemnation refers to how people either want to see other people punished for behaving in certain ways, or will actively punish other people for behaving in certain ways. Now, both of these systems, conscience and condemnation, are using moral perceptions as their guides. The key difference is that one of these systems, conscience, regulates your own behavior, while the other system, condemnation, regulates the behavior of others. And what's really crucial here is that moral conscience does not in any straightforward way explain condemnation. That is, if I don't want to steal something, or I don't want to have sex with the chicken carcass, that doesn't really explain why I think other people should be prevented from doing so, why I'm going to involve myself in other people's conflicts. Or to put this perhaps in a less moral dilemma, let's say a dietary example. Just because I don't want to eat a mayonnaise sandwich, that would not in any way explain why I think other people should be prevented from eating those sandwiches or punished if they do so. However, there's a readily explainable path for moral conscience that follows in a very straightforward way from condemnation. That is, if we begin with the premise that people are going to be punished for taking certain actions, a moral conscious system can be explained very easily as a mechanism to preempt and avoid that punishment. If I know other people are going to punish me for stealing, a cognitive system that encourages me to not steal can yield some very tangible benefits. So to make this as clear as possible, our moral conscience, this inner voice that tells us what's right and what's wrong, that can be very easily explained as a defense mechanism against condemnation. That's a very plausible function. But the reverse isn't true. Just because we don't want to take a certain action, that doesn't explain why we think others shouldn't be allowed to take that action. Condemnation explains conscience. And so this helps the authors explain something we've all seen before, which is moral hypocrisy. When someone is willing to engage in a behavior that they believe is morally wrong and condemn other people for doing, but they do it themselves. If conscience is this preemptive defense mechanism against condemnation, if someone judges their own behavior to be unlikely to be detected or punished, they might engage in something knowing that it's wrong. That is, moral hypocrisy exists because you don't need to defend against punishment if you don't think you're going to be punished in the first place. If you're wondering why people are hypocrites, morally, that's why. So to recap, up to this point here, we have our moral psychology that's a perceptual system. It perceives an element of right and wrong in the actions of others. And it tends to focus on human behavior per se. So it's a very narrow scope in terms of what it attends to. It's not a system that appears well suited for maximizing welfare gains in the world because it imposes constraints on behavior, and constraints don't let you reach the best outcome all the time. And as Discoli and Kurzban correctly note, the focus of behavior is kind of peculiar, and it's one that's rather specific to the domain of morality. In one of their examples, they note that people may focus on a behavioral rule like never exchange sex for money. Prostitution is morally wrong, and you should never do it, regardless of whether the prostitute and the person who paid for the prostitute end up better off at the end of their transaction. It's wrong to do that, even if there are benefits to doing it. But this focus on behavior doesn't tend to exist with precautionary rules, like don't drive through a stop sign, without stopping, of course. Very few people would maintain that you should be forced to stop at a stop sign in the event there's an out-of-control truck behind you just barreling towards your car, and if you stop, it's going to hit you. In that case, many people will say, yeah, no, go through the stop sign, avoid the consequences, get the better outcome. It'd be very peculiar if people say, no, you must stop at the stop sign, even if it means that truck is going to hit you and destroy your car and possibly kill you. That is, we tend to focus on behavior in morality a lot more than consequences. Now, that's not to say the consequences of behavior never matter, of course. Consequences often do play a heavy role in our moral judgments, or at least the perception of consequences do. But when it comes to morality, people tend to focus heavily on behavior itself, regardless of its consequences. And that's a very peculiar thing to do. So to see this in action, we can return to the moral dumbfounding research we discussed it earlier. When participants were asked who, if anyone, was harmed by the action they read about, again, like the man who has sex with the chicken carcass, or the siblings that engage in consensual incest that doesn't result in children or psychologically harm them. Well, a lot of people will say, okay, I guess no one was harmed in this, but it's still wrong. What's actually even a little more curious is that a substantial minority of people will actually indicate sometimes that people were victims of themselves. That is, the man who had sex with a chicken carcass before eating it, or the brother and the sister that engaged in mutually consensual, pleasurable incest, that they victimized themselves in some capacity. They perceive consequences, sometimes, where none truly seem to exist. And sometimes people even posit the existence of very abstract victims. Another one of the moral dumbfounding stories is someone comes across a flag, their country's flag, in the garage. And this flag is very old and damaged, and they're just going to get rid of it anyway. But instead of getting rid of it, they decide to cut it up into strips and use that cloth strip to clean their toilet. Was it wrong to do that? Some people will say yes. And you ask them, well, who, if anyone, was harmed by this behavior? And sometimes they say the person who cut up the flag was harmed by their behavior because they're going to feel guilty later for doing it. And sometimes they posit the existence of abstract entities that were harmed. Oh, society was harmed. The nation was harmed by not disposing of the flag in a more dignified way. So when it comes to morality, sometimes consequences matter. And sometimes they matter so much people will make up consequences where none seem to exist. But other times the consequences don't seem to matter in our judgment. And there's really been a series of great philosophical debates over this. People like Immanuel Kant who will say behaviors are right or wrong irrespective of their consequences. Lying is always wrong, even if it makes people better off. And then there are some people that will say actions are either right or wrong based on those consequences. It's a big philosophical debate. And so what we really want to try to figure out here is why do consequences sometimes matter and why do consequences sometimes not matter? These are very strange and inconsistent little judgments. It's a point we're going to return to later, but bear it in mind for now. So now that we have this general grasp on what we're talking about when we say morality, and what some of the component parts of this psychological system seems to do, we can move on to what Discoli and Kurzban consider the three major mysteries of morality. What are we trying to really explain here? For them, these focuses are, first, why do people care about the behavior of others on a moral level at all? That is, why do they pass moral judgment? Why do people ever involve themselves in the disputes of others and punish them for their behavior, which risks a bunch of conflict-related costs? And why are people ever impartial in their moral judgments? Now, we hinted at impartiality before with this focus on behavior. But impartiality, in this case, means people will condemn a behavior regardless of the identity of the person who engages in it. That is, if lying is wrong, it's because the behavior of lying is wrong. And this doesn't matter whether it's a friend who lied, or a family member who lied, or a stranger who lied, or an enemy who lied. It's the behavior itself that's wrong. Indeed, as the authors note, these three mysteries of morality are in fact all visually represented in the depictions of Lady Justice, which we actually saw in the last slide. Let me pull that up again so you can take a peek. Where you see Justice being depicted as this person holding a scale and a sword while wearing a blindfold. The scale in this case is the judgment of others, the moral judgment. The sword is the condemnation, the punishment of others. And the blindfold is the impartiality. She punishes regardless of who engages in the behavior, whether it's a friend, family member, stranger, or enemy. And so the question I want to ask is, what function is our moral psychology serving in pursuing these behaviors? And indeed, the blindfold here, as the authors note, might be the strangest of these things to explain. Moral systems focus on behavior per se, not the identity of the actors. So taking a moral stance can frequently mean you're going to side against your friends, you're going to side against your family, you're going to side against your social allies. And this can do some rather severe damage to social relationships, both in the present and the future, because people really don't take kindly to those who side against them, who condemn them. And people get especially upset when a friend does it to them. If a stranger steals from you, this probably upsets you, and understandably so. But if a friend steals from you, this is an extra layer of betrayal that makes people feel excessively bad. And as the authors note, even though sometimes people do side with others because of their relationship to them, my country, right or wrong, my friend, no matter what they did, sometimes people are partial in these disputes. They take sides on the basis of identity. The fact that people are ever impartial to any degree at all is a really strange thing. Impartial behavior cuts against reciprocal altruism. It cuts against kin-directed altruism. It cuts against alliances and a great many other useful relationships we build up over the years. So why do people ever judge others impartially to any degree? It's a very, very strange mystery. So how did Ascoli and Kurzban explain these and other mysteries of morality, now knowing that our focus should be on explaining why people morally condemn others for behaviors and enter into disputes in the first place? Well, they do so in a follow-up paper entitled A Solution to the Mysteries of Morality, of course. And in this follow-up paper, the authors argue that the biological function of moral condemnation is to minimize conflict-related costs to third parties. And the third parties use their moral perceptions to coordinate side-taking in these conflicts. The logic goes something like this. Conflicts in general tend to be costly because they often have to be escalated to physical combat to settle them. If you imagine our old example, the elephant seal, if you have two males that are going to fight over the same territory, they don't start by physically fighting each other. Usually this conflict begins by them signaling to each other how formidable they are. So you could make yourself appear larger, you could flash your tusks or whatever other weaponry you got, claws, teeth. You could vocalize, like scream, cats hissing. And what you're trying to do is signal to the other male how powerful you are. We see this in boxers, for instance, as well, during the customary stare downs before the fight. They're trying to signal how formidable they are as fighters. And if these signals prove to be effective, that is, if they honestly signal that one male is very likely to win the fight, and it's not going to be close, the smaller male may then leave before it's ever escalated to physical violence. Because the smaller male knows they're very likely to lose this conflict, it's better for them to not engage in it in the first place and leave and live to fight another day. Because no fight takes place, the dispute can be settled with minimal, if any, costs. But what happens when the fight's more closely matched? Where both males have a real chance to win the conflict. Then the signaling doesn't really work. If neither one backs down, then you have to escalate the conflict to a physical fight to resolve it. And these physical fights come with costs. Whether you win or lose, you might get chewed up. You might get cut. You might get knocked unconscious. You might be physically harmed, have some bones broken. Both parties are looking to avoid these costs. And if the signaling is ineffective, you do need to escalate them. And a similar logic plays out when this conflict involves multiple other parties, that is, a conflict between groups, but here the scales can very easily tip. One large human can probably beat up a smaller human. But that might be more troublesome for the one large person if they have to beat up two smaller people. And their chances are even worse of winning that fight if you have to beat up 5 other people. So when conflicts are heavily lopsided in terms of which group has more people supporting them, you can usually resolve those conflicts without the need to escalate them. If I have 5 people that are siding against me, my chances of winning a fight against 5 people are dramatically declining. And so I'm not going to bother engaging in a fight I'm going to lose. I will just walk away. So as such, when joining conflicts, these third parties, these unrelated bystanders, face a problem of not being on the losing side of the conflict. Because if they all coordinate on one side, you have this lopsided conflict that doesn't need to be escalated. No one suffers costs except for the person getting punished, of course. And the third parties can minimize the costs of their involvement. So if these bystanders can coordinate their side-taking behaviors in disputes, conflicts can be ended quickly and decisively without anyone needing to really fight. So in the view of the authors, morality is this coordination device. Effectively, it's like a traffic light. People focus on behavior per se, because when it comes to side-taking behaviors in a conflict, behaviors are publicly observable signals that can be used to coordinate around. So if someone engages in an immoral behavior, this behavior can be observed by third parties. These third parties can then all join in the conflict on the same side against the person who behaved immorally, resulting in heavily lopsided conflicts that should end in minimal costs. Because after all, if people were to join conflicts strictly on the basis of existing relationships, I side with friends or family regardless of behavior, this can create very costly group-on-group conflicts that are relatively even matched and need to be escalated, and that involves a lot of costs people want to avoid. So in the view of the authors here, the purpose of morality, the biological function, is to end disputes quickly and avoid these conflict-related costs. So in this perspective, the content of morality isn't terribly important. That is, what's right and wrong isn't terribly important, in much the same way that a traffic light has no necessary connection between red means stop and green means go. Red could mean stop, but hypothetically, red could also mean go, or blue could mean go, or any color could technically mean go. What's important for a traffic light is that all drivers are sharing the same representation of what means stop and go, and behaving accordingly to coordinate their driving behavior. So in a moral context, then, it should be, in their view, just as easy to condemn someone for murder as it is to condemn them for wearing mixed fabric clothing, at least in theory. What is punished is less important than the fact that this punishment is coordinated. However, even as I was reading their paper at this point, I feel that their functional explanation breaks down in some fairly major ways. Specifically, morally condemned behaviors often tend to be nothing like a traffic light in many cases, because behavior isn't always, and certainly perhaps not even often, publicly observable. People have a remarkable habit of condemning people for things they didn't witness, and rather condemn them on the basis of things they think they might have done. And this tendency to punish acts that weren't witnessed is so great that it's not hard to go out and find a tremendous list of people that have been exonerated for crimes that they were punished for, yet they didn't commit. If coordination itself is the goal of morality, and the content of morality doesn't much matter, that is, what we're coordinating to punish doesn't really matter, what matters is we're all on the same side, then using behavior is actually not a great way to achieve coordination, because you can't observe a lot of behavior the way you observe a traffic light. A better way to take sides in a dispute, it might seem, would be to do something like flip a coin. Something like flipping a coin would probably work just as well for coordination, if not better, because at least everyone can observe the outcome of a coin flip. Indeed, Discoli and Kurzban actually offer this example of a coin flip themselves as a type of coordination device. In their minds, it seems, we could hypothetically coordinate our punishment behaviors around coin flips, but we don't. We don't flip coins to determine what side we take on a moral dispute, and many people would say, in fact, such system would be absolutely atrocious for figuring out who we punish and who we don't. Second, as the authors note, people often do end up rather discoordinated in these conflicts. And this is because people do take sides on the basis of very different things. Sometimes people will side because of loyalty to friends or family, and that can create discoordination. So if people are using a strategy of siding on the basis of friends and siding on the basis of family and sometimes siding on the basis of moral behavior, if people are using a variety of different strategies to determine which side they take in a dispute, and morality is just one of them, this is going to make it a lot more difficult for third parties to end up on the numerically advantaged winning side, because their strategy is one of many, and there's no guarantee other people are going to be using their same strategy. So maybe if someone did behave wrong, they did something immoral, but they happen to have 30 friends with them, condemning them doesn't seem like the prudent idea. In order to make these conflicts lopsided, you would need a lot of third parties to enter these conflicts together, and they all have to agree with each other about which side they are on for this coordination explanation to work. And you need this many people precisely because humans do form rather large alliances. And a moral violator that brings their allies into a conflict means you need even more third parties to make it a lopsided outcome. If I have 30 friends, you need probably like 60, 70 friends to come and make that fight very lopsided, and that's hard to do. In fact, that's doubly hard to achieve when you consider the sheer amount of moral disagreement that exists in the first place. That is, people vary a lot on what acts they think are and are not morally acceptable. There's far less than universal agreement there. It's not hard for any of us to think of morally contentious issues. And that's a problem, because it means people are going to be using different moral rules to choose sides in a conflict, and different moral rules lead to discoordination. To use our traffic light example here, imagine how effective traffic lights would be for guiding traffic if even 10% of people disagreed whether red meant stop or go. If even a small number of drivers think that red means go, that can discoordinate all driving. Morality does not seem to work like a traffic light in this regard. And on top of all of these issues with their idea, most importantly, the coordination function they propose overlooks one rather large detail that still needs to be explained, which is, why do people get involved in the conflicts of others at all? Wouldn't it be a great method of reducing conflict-related costs if you just stayed out of other people's conflicts altogether? Because if you don't enter into other people's conflicts in the first place, it seems you're going to take your conflict-related costs and drop those to zero in a real hurry. By using moral perceptions to entangle yourself in other people's lives and other people's conflicts, even if you're likely to end up on the winning side, you're still creating the potential for costs where none need to exist in the first place. For some reason, the explanation offered by Discoli and Kurzban never actually addressed this point. That is, if you want to minimize conflict-related costs, what if you just don't involve yourself in the conflicts of others? That seems like a rather easy solution. Why are people getting involved at all? And there's also a challenge to their explanation with this idea of solitary moral wrongs that we saw before. The man goes to the store, gets the chicken carcass, comes home, has sex with it, cooks it and eats it. Is that wrong? He's alone. He's not creating a conflict between other people. Yet people perceive this act often to be wrong, and that it should be prevented, and that it should be punished. In this case, it seems that people are creating a conflict where none previously existed. So not only are our perceptions of morality causing us to get involved in conflicts we don't need to involve ourselves in, but sometimes it looks like they're even creating conflicts where none existed before. Now, to some extent, the authors try to address this point, noting that people sometimes do represent victims in solitary acts. A nation was harmed when you cut up a flag and used it to clean a toilet. A person harmed himself when he went out and had sex with that chicken carcass. But that doesn't really explain why people seem interested in actively creating these conflicts between imaginary parties where none existed before. They're involving themselves in conflicts and creating them where they didn't exist. How exactly is this minimizing costs? There's also the matter of proportionality that we mentioned earlier. This idea that the punishment for a crime should fit the severity of the crime. The coordination model really doesn't account for this well. The authors attempt to account for it by suggesting that third parties need to decide whose side they're on in a conflict if both people do something wrong. I steal from you, and then you punch me, and then they're going to get involved in this conflict and punish someone on the basis of who did something worse. But the problem with this explanation is that even if that was true, that only explains what side you take in a debate. It's more or less agnostic to how much you punish somebody. If you were attempting to deter an act, surely enacting a brutal punishment is more effective than a minor one. And in fact, under the coordination model, the amount of punishment seems to be beside the point as well. In their mind, the major function of morality is what side are you taking. It's not about deterring the behavior, and it's not about punishing someone, it's about ending the conflict. So this raises another problem we have to start thinking about. In addition to people frequently being discoordinated in conflicts, because maybe they're picking sides on the basis of who their friends and family are instead of who did what, and also being discoordinated because they disagree about what's morally wrong and what should be punished, and they disagree because they don't know who actually did what because they didn't observe it in the first place, people are also usually discoordinated with respect to how much punishment they think behaviors deserve. It doesn't take a lot of searching to find cases where people might even agree in a moral act has taken place, let's say murder. Someone murdered someone else, everyone saw it, everyone agreed that's what happened, and everyone picks the side against the murderer. And people can still disagree on how much punishment they think the murderer deserves for their behavior. Should they be put to death? What about life in jail? 20 years in jail? 5 years in jail, a year in jail, a week of parole. Is the purpose of this punishment to be punitive, to inflict costs, or is the purpose of this punishment to reform the person who did something wrong? These are questions that people really don't tend to come to the same answer to consistently. If you don't agree on how much to punish, coordination becomes difficult in yet another realm. In fact, ironically enough, disagreements over how much to punish someone for doing something wrong can actually create an entirely separate conflict. You and I might agree, okay, murder is wrong, this person murdered this person, we're on the same page. And then I say, we should put the murderer to death. And you say, whoa, 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 death penalty is really inhumane. Let's give him 20 years in jail. And now all of a sudden there's a conflict between us, where none existed before. And this is even when people agree on what acts are wrong and agree on what happened in the first place. So on balance, the Scully and Kurzban work really does a fantastic job of outlining the questions we should be thinking about when it comes to our moral psychology. They identify the structure of moral problems, and they pinpoint a very important explanatory relationship between moral conscience and moral condemnation. Generally, their analysis is very fantastic, and I would recommend their papers on the subject to anyone who's curious. However, in trying to provide a solution to their problem, I think they're focusing on the wrong thing. They're attempting to explain one particular problem that third parties face once they've already entered into a moral dispute. And as a result, their explanation doesn't really achieve a good fit between the features of our moral psychology on one hand and the proposed function on the other. So instead, the big question we want to solve here is, why do people get involved in the disputes of others in the first place? Why were so many people on Twitch interested in watching the trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, even though none of them knew Johnny Depp or Amber Heard personally, even though none of them were particularly affected by the behavior of either party? There was still this intense interest in who did what and who should be punished, and it captured so much attention. Why are people entering into these conflicts that they're not involved in? What benefits do you achieve by doing so? That should really be the main focus of our analysis. What are we trying to explain here functionally, and what are the benefits? We want to focus on that predominantly instead of what costs you're trying to avoid once you enter into them. So once we can answer this question, why are you getting into conflicts in the first place, we can test our explanation for this against the features of our moral judgments, like perceptions of victims, even when none might actually exist, perceptions of harm mattering sometimes but not always, why are punishments proportional, and many other things we actually haven't gotten into yet, which we will next time. So since we're a little short on time for right now, this is where I'm going to leave it off. And next time we're going to review another theory on morality that attempts to explain the function of it. And I happen to really love this other paper because I'm actually the one who wrote it.